Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak here, and thank you, David, for the introduction. I'm not actually going to go through lots of detail about the legislation, because I presumed that David was going to cover a lot of that, which he have. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means and how we implement it, and I think actually it might be quite surprising where we end up at the end of all of this. Okay? So I'm going to talk about what's the impact of regulations on research, and I'm going to look back a little bit, but I'm also going to look forward. Some of the looking forward obviously is my personal views, but nevertheless I think it's something that's interesting for us to discuss at an event such as this. So what do we know about the research which is currently being done and has been done in the past? So that's part of what I'll look at. I'm going to talk about two key ethical principles of animal research. I'm going to ask the question, can regulations keep up with the pace and of change in science? Is regulation the best way of achieving that? And then I'm going to try to draw some conclusions out of all of that. So first of all, let's learn a little bit, let's get a bit of facts under the table in terms of what actually is happening, what animals are being used first. So here I've taken the statistics, and here in the UK we do pretty accurately record the statistics of animal use each year. And in fact, next Tuesday, a week on Tuesday, we will be announcing the statistics for 2012, which is a count of every animal and every procedure that's been performed during the year 2012. And in that sense, we're unique globally in that we have such accurate statistics, which go back many years, and I'll show you some of the data that we've got on that in the past as well. And what we know from that is that almost 80% of procedures that are carried out on animals are carried out on rats, mice, other rodents, small mammals and rabbits. If we take that, almost 80% plus almost 20% on fish, amphibians, reptiles and birds, you can see that actually accounts for the vast majority of animals that are used in research. So the other species that, for right or wrong, tend to attract greater attention in terms of the public's view of what's going on in animal research, that is the dogs, cats, small carnivores, primates and so on. Very small numbers of those animals being used. And that's something important that we should keep driving down those numbers for reasons of public concern, if nothing else. What sort of things are these animals being used for? Well, we know that almost 50%, 44% of these animals are being used for breeding. Mostly these are genetically altered animals for research and development of new treatments. Now, just because it's breeding and they're genetically altered doesn't necessarily mean that that is mild or indeed possibly sub-threshold. Some of those animals may be quite severely impacted by the genetic alterations that they have. So we shouldn't just assume that that 44% represents animals that suffer very little at all. Some of them may, but a vast majority of them, and unfortunately at the moment we don't know what that figure is from these statistics. I'll come back to that a little bit in a moment. But a vast majority of those animals will suffer very little apart from being in a housing system and being bred within that system. Maybe now would be a point to just do a brief diversion, because we talked a little bit about retrospective assessment just now. But you have to think about looking backwards in three different elements that the new legislation brings in. One of them is actual severity monitoring. So at the moment when we record these data, we record at the start of the procedure. So an animal commences a procedure and we record it as a procedure. In future, as of January of next year onwards, under the new directive, we will be recording at the end of a procedure, and we'll be recording the actual severity. So every animal that gets used will have its severity reported and recorded. So that's the first thing. That covers everything. We also have what's called animal welfare bodies in every establishment, and a role of the animal welfare bodies clearly delineated in our guidance and in the directive is to monitor the progress of projects ongoing in their facilities. Now we know some of them do that a lot better than others, and clearly we need to try and drive the standards up on that and put a lot of attention, but their role is to monitor the ongoing performance of the projects at their places in order to identify ways in which the 3 Rs can be better implemented. So when we talk, we call that retrospective review, and that's expected of animal welfare bodies. So when we talk about retrospective assessment, that as defined in the directive is a very small number of projects which the directive identifies that involve non-human primates and or severe procedures, and to that we have added in the UK cats, dogs and horses. Those projects have to undergo retrospective assessment, which is a formal process at some time during the course of the project. So don't think about the limitations of retrospective assessment as being the only way in which we can look backwards. We will be able to, in future, look back project by project, look at what was prospectively assessed for the project and what is retrospectively in actual severity being reported for every animal on that project, and do those analyses. So we will in future have a lot of more power in these statistics than I think we're able to at the moment. I'm going to whiz through the other things there, so but you can see there the breakdown broadly of the pattern of use of animals in research. And the sort of things, again, that get public attention are things like safety testing of non-medical products. And that accounts for about 2%, and most of that will be chemicals that are going to be used in the environment, and it's about safety of the environment, and it's about, frankly, regulations that require those tests to be done, rightly or wrongly. And there's a piece of work that we need to do there globally to try and drive down those regulations wherever they're inappropriate. So it's very easy for regulators who are out there trying to save the environment or keep the environment safe to just say, well, we've always done that animal test, so let's just carry on requiring it. So part of the job that we need to do, and I think the UK takes this very seriously, is to work hard on trying to establish change in that. And in fact, I'm going to the States for a week in early August with my minister for precisely that purpose, to talk to the US government and try and establish some better collaborations in terms of doing that. So that shows we have high-level ministerial interest in this topic and real commitment to trying to make a change. So let's look back then over a period of about 15 years where I pulled out the statistics to see what are the trends that have been happening. Have I got a pointer on this? No, maybe not, but you can see it. The upper part, you can see actually that apart from mice, which is the upper curve, fish, which is a little bit lower down there, the grey one, and that green curve which shows the birds, most species are reducing in terms of their use over this 15-year period.
Judy, I think there might be a...
Is there
just
a point?
quickly check. I think it might be. There you go.
Yeah, well, great.
It's that little red line there.
It's the red line, is it? Okay. So if we remove from that what I had here, this is all species. If we take out the most common species, I'm going to have to really do a driving lesson on this thing, I think. Oops, yeah, I am. Let's get back. Right, let me try this. Okay, so here, this is the one I showed you earlier. So what we've done is essentially expand the axis here. This is the line here for birds. And apart from that, where there's a slight increase showing over that 15-year period, and here are the ungulates, so that's the cattle, sheep, and so on, where it's a pretty steady line, and most of that is research for those species, where they are the target species of the research. Almost every other species is showing a decline, including here you can see all other rodents. So there's a movement away from these other species towards the mice and the fish. If we look at the pattern of that movement in mice here by genetic status, and those of you who work with genetically altered mice will see no surprises in this at all, the main increase has been here in the genetically manipulated GM mice. So that is mice that have been manipulated in the laboratory as opposed to mice that have been inbred so that their harmful mutants emerge. The harmful genetic mutants are staying more or less stable, that's the red piece, the red line at the bottom here, and there's a slight decrease actually in the use of normal animals, but that's more than overtaken by the increase in genetically manipulated mice. If we look at the use of fish over that same period, it's a different pattern in many ways. In that, as you can see, the greatest increase here is in the use of normal fish. This is a bit of a blip here, and I think in a way that's a bit of an artifact of counting, of some things that happened to happen during that particular year, which involve things like company mergers and so on. So take that as a smooth curve, effectively, that's increasing there and showing an increase mainly in normal animals over this period of time. I think that we're going to see a much greater increase in genetically manipulated fish over the coming years, particularly zebrafish, where we see a lot more use of those species. So this gives us a sort of picture of how are animals being used. So now I'm going to come back to the moral status of animals and what David has covered already, which is this very famous quote from Jeremy Bentham: the question is not can they reason, because there were arguments then, Cartesian arguments and so on, and people like David Morton here can cover these much better philosophically than I, about whether animals could reason. Well, actually, it's not whether they can reason, but can they suffer, and that very famous line of his. And this actually brings us into the utilitarianism, which is classically underlies the kind of regulatory system that we have in the UK now. So we use within that system two key ethical principles. The first one is to promote alternatives, and you'll know there's a coalition commitment. The coalition government has a commitment to promote alternatives, to work towards reducing the use of animals in research. And the second one we've heard a lot about, and I'll touch on also, is about assessing harms versus benefits. So what about those 3 R's? Well, sometime back in the 1970s, I, as a very young veterinarian, joined an organisation called UFOR as a very junior staff member there. And on the bookshelf, I found a book called The Principles of Humane Experimental Technique, which I'd never heard of before, by a couple of guys called Russell and Birch. And I read it. It's actually a bit of a turgid volume, I have to say. But actually, inside it, I could see a most exciting approach to how we should think about the use of animals in research. And my thinking was, why on earth are we not using this? So this was in the mid-70s, early mid-70s, that this was the case. Things have changed phenomenally since then, and particularly here in the UK and Europe, I would say, the 3 R's have moved from being something that's a bit esoteric and scientists think is a bit of a threat to their being able to carry on doing what they want to do, into being something which is much more grounded in the way that people think about science. I'm not saying that happens all over the world, so I talk quite a lot internationally in Asian countries, in North America and so on, and I think there's still movement to go in those countries. So if I talk about the 3 R's in America, the first reaction can often be a little bit of defensiveness before we start getting into the constructive discussion about, well, why is this actually a positive way of looking at the way you do your research? And the same applies in places like China and Japan. So I think we can be quite proud of ourselves in this country for the progress that we've made. So let's just make sure everybody understands what we mean by the 3 R's. The first one is replacement, and I deliberately look at them in this order because I think this is the order we should always consider the 3 R's in a proposal for use of animals in research. The first question is, can we replace the use of animals? Do we actually need to use animals at all? And replacement can either be absolute, where it's using totally non-animal methods, such as in silico computer methodologies, using human tissues, data from humans and so on. It would be much better if we could get better access to human tissues, I must admit, and that's a piece of work that I think we need to do with the Human Tissue Authority. The relative replacement is using cells, tissues and organs from animals, using them in vitro, but they have derived from animals, and therefore it's not a total replacement, but relatively speaking it uses far fewer animals, and we class that as a replacement. Reduction. So yes, we've decided we cannot replace, we need to still use animals. We should therefore reduce the number of animals as far as we possibly can. And this involves using fewer animals, and often that can be achieved through good experimental design. And I see Michelle here, Frame, is doing some really good work at the moment on improving experimental design and helping to train scientists to design their experiments better. So that's a very good, a very important step. Or obtaining the same information from fewer animals or more information from the same number of animals. And finally, refinement. So now, yes, we've reduced the number of animals as much as possible. What should we do to reduce the severity that those animals will experience? So we use methods which minimize pain or distress. We use species perhaps with less capacity to feel pain. I've deliberately put a question mark there. We have the Cambridge Declaration now, which tells us that the majority of animals are conscious and experience consciousness. And so I think we need to always keep our minds open to what do we mean by this capacity to feel pain and what is our most current understanding of it. And it does include improvements in housing care, for example, enrichment. So I would definitely, and we expect people to include that in their consideration of refinement. So this is part of what then, when we come to looking at harm-benefit assessment, is going to allow us to, and I put very much in inverted commas, quantify what the harms are. Because we've had some discussion about harm-benefit assessment. It is not a mathematical quantification. If we delude ourselves that it is, then we're wrong. It involves a lot of professional judgment. And at the end of the day, it probably involves a lot of trying to get the harms down as low as you can, and then say, okay, well, let's look at the benefits, which I'll look at in a moment. Does that feel, in my professional view, that that is an appropriate balance? There is an important difference, by the way, which was touched on earlier. Under the old legislation, the law required us to weigh harms against benefits. What David showed you is the wording in the new legislation, which is the same as the directive, of course, which requires the harms to be justified against the benefits. Now, you may say that's angels on the head of a pin, but actually it's quite important. And I think there is an important move in the right direction there. So the piece that Andre was saying earlier that the Home Office might have said in the past, that there is no obligation, is that actually all the Act said was we needed to weigh one against the other. It didn't say what the outcome needed to be. Whereas if you've got to justify it, then that means there's a much more of an imperative about the outcome. So, first of all, we need to minimise the harms, clearly, by implementing the 3 Rs. But the big question then, having done that, is how do we assess benefits? Well, we do that partly by the overall evaluation of the proposed project. And by the way, it is the Home Office that determines what the severity limits will be. We might invite applicants to say what they think, but at the end of the day, the Secretary of State makes that decision. And that's on the advice of inspectors, and we do a lot of work to try and get consistency in that, because with 22 inspectors, you can get 22 different opinions. So there's a lot of work done to try and get that as consistent as possible. So how do we assess benefits? This is not easy. Project evaluation will help, and as I've said here, what largely one needs to do is to understand what is the foundation of knowledge on which this project is based. Because probably the project is not going to be, the benefit is not going to be I'm going to cure cancer. It's probably actually going to be based on this foundation of knowledge. I think I can make this incremental step towards what may ultimately become a human benefit in terms of a cure for a particular type of cancer. So anyone coming to us and saying, I want to do this because I'm going to cure cancer, is going to get sent away to go and think again. But if they come back and talk about an incremental step that they expect to be able to achieve, that is more realistic. And in order to be able to understand that incremental gain, we need to also understand the foundation of knowledge. So you'll see in what has to be submitted as part of the project license application is the background that they have to explain. What is the background science? Sometimes benefits are going to be quite distant, and particularly in basic research. This is really hard because often the benefit is basically an increase in knowledge, and that's very difficult to weigh and balance and justify in this harm-benefit assessment. And those are probably some of the most difficult assessments that inspectors have to do. I'm not saying we get it 100% right. David and I have discussions about this from time to time. We do actually talk, don't we, David? And sometimes we do need to think again, because the world is not a perfect place, and this is not a mathematical calculation. So I think in the UK we do a jolly good job at it, but it's not perfect. We also take a look at what is the likelihood of success. So we're going to look at the group. What's their past performance? Have they actually succeeded in the things that they said they were going to do previously? So have they got a good record? Have they got the skills and expertise within the group? And have they got the in-house resources to do this piece of work effectively? Have they got funding? Or is this some mad brain idea that they haven't yet got past the MRC or one of the research councils or the Wellcome Trust? Have they got collaborators who we think are going to really help them to make it successful? How much novelty is in the project? And if it's got a lot of novelty, are they proposing a plan of work that involves pilot studies that will allow them to learn from the pilots as they go forward and build on that knowledge. So is it well planned from that perspective? So all of this is measured in looking at that benefit. And at the end of the day, we try to make a professional judgment on the harm-benefit assessment. And it's often very challenging, but that's what we have to do. So what sort of things are benefits? Well, I don't know, you're a very mixed audience here, and there may be some of you here who feel there have been no benefits from animal research, and there may be others in the audience who feel there have been very great and significant benefits from animal research. What I've tried to do here is to identify some of the things that have changed over the many years in which we've been using animals in research. There is, in my view, the world has changed for the better in that time, and I think animal research has certainly contributed significantly to that. And by the way, some of those are things where we don't yet have the solutions, and we need still to keep working to get solutions, things like Lou Gehrig's syndrome and so on that are in there. But could we have to ask ourselves, could we have done all of this without using animals? Well, I think the answer inevitably is there's some of that probably we could have done without using animals if we'd had some of the technologies we now have available to us then. I think also there's quite a lot of that we couldn't have done at that time and still couldn't do without using animals. So my questions then are, is legislation the only tool? Is that alone that can determine this point, my question above? We actually need, and I feel very passionately about this, we need scientists to fully engage in determining the best scientific approach to achieving the benefit that they're trying to achieve. And we need to trust and incentivize scientists to seek alternative approaches. There needs to be that incentive there for them to look at ways in which they can do their science without the need to use animals wherever possible. And for that, we need greater openness and transparency, because that is part of what builds that trusting relationship. So I have a lot more insight into what goes on than probably anybody in this room does, because I do have the opportunity to be able to see what the proposals are, what the applications coming forward are, and so on. I think we need to have greater openness and transparency, and I'll come back a little bit more to that. So what is the role of legislation then? Does legislation drive good practices and improvement? Not on its own, it doesn't. Does it help to bring the stragglers along, those resistant to being regulated? No, it doesn't on its own. Of course it doesn't. It might help, but it doesn't do that. Does it give the public confidence that all is well? No, it doesn't. It helps. I think the public is comforted to know that we have a strict regulatory system, but it doesn't do that all on its own. Does it reinforce good culture by providing a framework for ethical practices? I think that's the key role of legislation, is to provide that framework which can then be used by those within the framework to drive ethical practices and ethical way of thinking, and that trust, incentivization and so on that's needed. So what does that framework need to look like then? Well, I think we need to promote, first of all, it has have as fundamentals those two key principles. So that's promoting the 3 R's and carrying out a harm-benefit assessment in the way in which we make decisions about what should go forward. It needs to identify places that are suitable, because we shouldn't just be doing research anywhere and everywhere. This room is not suitable for carrying out animal research in. And so it needs to identify what are the suitable places for this work to be done in, and who's responsible at those places for compliance. It needs to identify those people. It needs to ensure that people are trained and competent. And that's not just the scientists, but also the veterinarians, the animal care staff, everybody who is part of this schema within which animal research is carried out. It needs to provide for a project evaluation, ethical review, whatever you choose to call it, type of system, and that's where the 2 key principles that I've talked about the 3 R's and harm-benefit assessment need to come in. It needs to establish something local, whether we call it an animal welfare body, an ethical review body, or whatever, something that is looking at the picture locally and determining what is going on and able to consider that at a local level. And I would say within that also acts as the place where people can go and report if they have concerns about what's going on. So I don't like using the term whistleblowers, and I would think that it would be nice if BUAV didn't have to put infiltrators in, because people within the organisation were doing that themselves. So it needs to be able to do that. Okay. It needs to assure access to good quality information, and it needs to adopt a risk-based approach to inspection. You're always going to have limited resources for inspection. I think actually 22 inspectors for 175 places is not a bad ratio. But nevertheless, we have to make sure that we assign those resources effectively. Okay, I'm going to go on from there. So what about the future? Will regulations be drivers or followers of future changes? So this is me with my crystal ball now, okay? I think in 25 years' time, regulatory toxicology will focus on mechanisms, pathways of toxicity using in vitro and in silico predictive models. And I think there will few animals. I don't think we will get away from animal use totally, particularly in pharmaceuticals, where the boundary between activity and toxicity is fairly narrow because they're all biologically active. And I mentioned there some really exciting work being done at the Wyss Institute in Boston, and we will be visiting there with Lord Taylor, the Minister, at the end of this month as part of the US trip, where they're developing organs on chips. And these organs truly do mimic amazingly. I think that scientists in basic research will be striving with enthusiasm for alternatives, and I've underlined that because they will look at it. What excites me is seeing scientists reporting about the work they've done to develop alternatives where their science has improved by using the alternatives. And I can give you a number of examples of that. So it's not us pushing them, it's actually them saying, I can do better science by doing this. I think the total numbers may actually remain level or even may rise, but more of them are going to be fish, invertebrates and lower species, and we're going to be exploring mechanisms in those species rather than models. So how will a regulatory system serve to reflect and promote this? I think that's a real challenge for us as regulators. What's our role within that? There is a role, but it's not being a policing kind of regulator. Housing designed for needs. Current housing standards for most species are not based on scientific evidence of their needs. I think in 25 years' time, there will be extensive data that allows us to know, note I don't just say house sizes, but shapes of houses and environments that animals live in. We will know much more about that, and it'll be based on performance, not just some sort of dimensional standards, and a sustainable approach. We'll understand it not just for species, but individual strains, and it will be evidence-based. But how will regulatory codes keep pace with the diversity of those sources of evidence? Use of human material. I mentioned earlier about using human tissue banks. ACHM is animals containing human material, and we are able now to insert human material into animals. There is quite good guidance produced by the Academy of Medical Sciences a couple of years ago, which we're looking at the implementation of right now, okay? I'm going to carry on through this fast, okay? So we're technically able to do these things. They're going to raise a lot of ethical questions for us, okay? So what tools other than regulations will we use to deliver the right ethical decisions on that? And greater transparency. I don't think that I think public confidence is definitely diminished by the veil of secrecy that is over us at the moment. In 25 years' time, I think we will have defined and agreed what must be kept confidential. We will be openly publishing everything else, and furthermore, it'll be an open access databases that the public will have access to and able to mine that data. And I think we'll have open house policies so that people are encouraged to visit facilities in which animal research is done. It's not going to be legislation that will deliver that, but what can we do to help to support the delivery of that sort of thing? So I am coming to a conclusion now. I think in achieving the regulatory balance, we need to think about how do we balance science quality with animal welfare, because by getting that balance right, the public does want science to generate new cures for diseases and so on that are currently major problems for us. But they also want to know that animals are not being used or suffering unnecessarily. And it's by getting that balance right we support public confidence in an effective way. And there are lots of things we can do. I'm by no means complacent. I think there are a lot of things we can do to move forward, but it's this balance that's really important as we go forward. So can legislation create a culture of care? No, but it should promote such a culture. That's really important. The culture comes from within the organisation. Can legislation keep up with scientific advances? No, but it needs to be flexible enough to respond to them. Can it deliver public confidence? Yes, partially it can, through that balance I've just talked about, but the behaviour of scientists is fundamental to that, and they're part of the culture that we need to encourage. So the public seeks a culture of care. Regulations tend to follow cultural change rather than leading it. Regulation should therefore, I believe, focus on, and this is what we work on, providing the right framework to encourage cultural change and ensuring flexibility to adapt to ethical challenges of new science. Okay, thank you.